Hi everyone, welcome this evening. Switching the chat over. I'm Marianne, Head of Programme at Bluecoat, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome choreographer, dance artist and teacher Seke Chimutengwende this evening to our in conversation. He chose the very atmospheric music that we all were in a waiting room with, so we're going to talk about that later. But he's here to talk about his research around haunting horror, colonial histories and dance with us tonight. So thank you for joining us. Thank you. I'm just going to say to everyone that we're recording and we'll release a version of this later that's captioned, and yeah, we also warmly encourage questions which you can drop in the Q&A box, but I'll keep an eye on the chat as well. So I think that's our housekeeping done for this evening. So thank you so much, Seke, for joining us. In the middle of some action research that we've been delighted to partner on at Bluecoat. And you've very helpfully sort of broke this down for me in 3 parts when we were talking on Friday. That the research sort of deals with history in the present, colonial histories, haunting, ghosts, horror, black horror, and then dance practice. And that was your right down that, which is a kind of fascinating combination and how they Venn diagram. I just wanted to ask about the relationship between the first 2, between those histories and horror and haunting, and then we'll kind of move on to talk about the dance practice and what you're doing at the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Marianne. Thanks for inviting me to this. And yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in. So I'm what I'm looking at is the relationship between haunting, ghosts, haunted houses, horror, the relationship between that and how histories of slavery and colonialism, how they haunt the present or exist in the present, the legacies of that. And I guess I think for me that sort of that idea came around thinking about things that are here and not here at the same time, and for different reasons. So things that I guess in general the past is both with us and not with us. It's not with us because it has passed, but its legacies, its remnants, the residue, the after effects linger on. So I guess that's sort of the broad idea. And I guess like thinking around horror, that these histories of slavery and colonialism are to me horrific, in the sense that I look into it, I read about it, and it horrifies me, and it makes me feel often like I don't want to keep reading about it or thinking about it or looking at it, because it's and in a way actually I've been researching this project for about 2 years, and I'm it's actually getting more and more horrific for me the more I kind of read about it, sort of more kind of terrible, in terms of what has gone on, and I think I guess in some cases there's a sense that like the history is terrible, but you don't necessarily notice that history in the present. For example, part of this research, I'm going to a stately home near Nottingham called Newstead Abbey, which is a really nice place to go for a day out, and it's got a beautiful gardens, and it's very interesting, and kind of it's a sort of family day out. but it's a lot of money that went into that house and that estate came from
Mm.
a plantation owner in who had plantations in the Caribbean, and so made a lot of money. So in that context, you sort of you go there and you won't notice the connection. So there's a sort of you would have to kind of be told that, and then you might feel there's something strange about it, about being there or uncomfortable. But otherwise, you wouldn't necessarily find it uncomfortable to go there. But I guess there are many other things, other legacies that are, still horrific now, that were horrific. A lot of the racial violence, inequality. Um, there's a lot of there are a lot of very violent colonial legacies in the present. So it's not that it's necessarily something that's we don't see now. It's more that I think for me, what it is the connection between the past and the present is obscured, often, especially in places like Europe, and America. The connection between what happened 100, 200, 400 years ago, that and the continued violence now is sort of obscured. It's sort of it sort of seems like it's an accident that um, Africa is a very poor continent in general, as in the people there are mostly very poor. That's sort of seen as somehow just like the way it is, or an accident rather than a legacy of those histories. So I guess that for me is that's what I'm thinking about, I guess, with this relationship between haunting, horror, and yeah, how these histories live on in the present. And yeah, maybe one last thing to say about that. There's something also to me kind of sometimes it feels inappropriate to talk about these histories that are very real and serious in terms of genres like horror, which are often kind of ridiculous and yeah, associated with entertainment, even if they're kind of can be gory and scary. They're there to entertain people. And I think somehow the inappropriateness, when it does feel inappropriate, there's something kind of interesting for me about that. It kind of actually kind of connects me to the subject more because I sort of notice that disconnect. Um, and yeah, so there's something. I guess it's sort of sometimes it's possible to get kind of very worthy about these subjects and sort of moralistic, and I feel like that can then lead to a place where you sort of don't go any further than like, oh, it's just about bad people doing bad things, rather than um, looking at how it's a systemic issue that everyone is sort of implicated in somehow. Um, so, yeah.
No,
Um,
absolutely. And I mean, anywhere that lives sort of after empire, it's kind of systematically within economy and education and all sorts of kind of layers. And then, as you're saying, there are certain sites which hold this history more directly. And the reason we were interested, obviously, for Bluecoat has that kind of history in the building, which has been unpacked since the kind of 70s or the 80s, but it's never resolvable. It has to be discovered by every generation, and often it's been through artists and commissioning. But the history of the building has got two histories: one of a charity school funded by the international slave trade, and then one of an art centre that comes later. And this unpacking of history is kind of unresolvable. But for the Liverpool as a city has renamed streets and taken down statues and been a very activist city over the decades, but you can never, structurally address what's happened. So it's that kind of tension as well, I think, within kind of sites. I'm just really interested in the current climate, which has developed over probably the last 5 years or maybe more, where there's a, a backlash against unpacking history, and it's a ridiculous one, and it's seen as kind of spoiling history or being unpatriotic. It's nothing that anyone watching would buy into as a value system. But I wondered how you're navigating that, or if it informs you. It's sort of some of the battles the National Trust have been having recently, and heritage sector, where it stands on revealing these histories, but whether if that is coming into the work at all.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't experienced it firsthand, but I'm very aware of it, and sort of been reading about it quite a lot, that backlash. And I guess well, on the one hand, it makes me feel like it's an important thing to be doing. If it's coming up against that backlash, it means that there's some shift happening. And I think it's been interesting over the last weekend with the football and the racial abuse that the footballers and other black people have received in the wake of that. There is a sense to me that there's like the backlash is coming because some kind of advance is being made. Um, so I guess that's kind of complex. On the one hand, I sort of feel like, um, I mean, I'm not like worried that my project's going to get shut down, but it does feel like in the context of kind of general climate of precarity, that backlash kind of, uh, I guess, augments that somehow. It does. So that it does sort of add to the precarity on that level, but I think it makes me feel like um, it makes me feel like the backlash is there because a lot of people are actually on side with these discussions, and people want to know about these histories, and I feel like there's a kind of common sense emerging around it, which the backlash is a response to.
Yeah, like a hysterical reaction to or something. But
Yeah, yeah,
um, and you played us in, I should say, with two tracks from Get Out, which is within this kind of amazing array of research that includes Toni Morrison's Beloved, ghost stories, reading about history, the latest kind of George Saunders. Have you, when you've been working with collaborators, which we'll talk about, this kind of group practice that you're part of, how have you shared that with other people, or have you done very solitary research and then brought that to your collaborators?
it's been a mix of things. So yeah, I'm working with five dancers for this project, and but I've done a lot of research on my own as well, and a lot of research with Charlie Ashwell, who's the dramaturg on this project. So we did a couple of weeks in the studio, just the two of us, together in 2019. Um, and then I've done a lot of reading and thinking on my own. And then I've had a lot of conversations with people as well, like conversations like this, but also informal ones. And I feel like we have looked at some of these texts in the studio, but it's not a kind of main focus of what we've been doing. But we have we've watched a documentary by David Olusoga, Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners. We watched that together, and we've looked at a bit at stuff. And they've also kind of been sharing what one of the dancers, Ming, is a big horror movie fan, so she's seen way more horror films than I have. So she's actually curated film lists for each of us to watch. sort of
Mm.
specifically. Um, yeah, so yeah, it's I think what we've been doing more in that sense in the studios is talking a lot about yeah, all these different elements, and how, yeah, I guess how they sort of what what they mean to us personally, and all of that. Um, yeah,
I'm going to get Rob, who's producing this, to share some images from your working process at the moment.
yeah,
So we'll
right,
just these have you sent them to us from the
yeah,
studio, um,
yeah,
just to look through. And what I should say, and I probably didn't make clear at the beginning in a way, is that you're partway through a discovery of what the final form of the piece will
yeah,
be. And
yeah,
so each time you bring your group together and share and then um, choreograph together, it moves it on. At what phase do you think you are in this kind of this research process?
yeah. Well, yeah. So in in 2019, I did a couple of weeks, just me and Charlie in the studio. And then last year we did a week with these dancers, with the five dancers on Zoom, um, as we were all spread out all over, yeah, even all over the world. And then, yes, since this spring, we had a couple of weeks at Dance 4 in Nottingham, which is where these photos are from. And now we've got this week, and we've got another couple of weeks left after this, and this is a kind of still a sort of research and development phase, and then we'll regroup again next year and kind of finish everything off. Well, that's the plan anyway. Um, yeah,
And
suddenly sounded very easy when I said it like that. But, yeah, yeah, hopefully.
no,
Um,
I was no, and so in a way they will, as individual performers, they'll retain the kind of physical memory of the movements and then of your choreography, and then you would reconvene for a performed work at some point. Yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, we were talking about that today about like what it will, who knows what will happen in the intervening gap, not only with us, but also in the world, and how that might, yeah, inform what we're doing.
And
Yeah.
just because I know often we have watching as many kind of practitioners or people making work as enjoying being an audience, has it been seamless for you bringing everyone together and getting the funding for like a multi-stage project, or has it had it as well as COVID, almost like COVID aside, but how, or with COVID, how has that kind of been to kind of convene a group to work together?
Yeah, definitely not seamless. Yeah, yeah. No, it's been yeah, very difficult, on, yeah, many levels, organizationally, I guess. It's, I don't know. In general, I just find it hard to get more than two people together on a specific time to do anything, let alone, do a project. But I think, yeah, some things that have been difficult are, yeah, coordinating not only the performers and my availability, also with the different partners who are um, supporting the project, the different organizations that are supporting the project. Um, yeah, it's very time consuming, and things have sort of had to shift for, obviously COVID was a big thing, and other reasons why dates have had to shift around. And then yeah, we actually put in, well, we did an initial Arts Council application, we were about to put it in, and then they closed all the applications in March last year, and then we did the application all over again, kind of put the project together afresh, and then didn't get funding that time. And so this is kind of the third time of putting the application together. And then even since then, there have been quite a few hiccups with, yeah, various things. So yeah, not very smooth running at all, but also not like yeah, people who are artists, that will be familiar to them. But yeah, this is
Yeah.
not massively atypical
No,
of
it's just
a
heartening to
process.
share the pain, because sometimes
Yeah,
from the outside, when you see an amazing production, you think it must have just flowed towards this point. But yeah, I do know from being part of
yeah.
the kind of behind the scenes how much it takes to bring this together. And are you thinking that this will be a work that could inhabit galleries, performance spaces? Sort of, it's not necessarily for the stage, because some often your work can appear in kind of different contexts. Or are you interested in going back into the kind of historic houses? Where are you
Yeah.
thinking you might end up?
Well, yeah, I guess yeah, well, one thing is I'd like to make something that can exist in a like proscenium black box space and also in a gallery space. I'd be interested to to make something that has that kind of flexibility. And um, yeah, it may be also that there's another kind of version or iteration of the work that happens in a stately home or in maybe in different stately homes. Yeah, we're going to one in a couple of weeks to sort of try that out. I have like different feelings about that. I think in a way, um, yeah, I guess on the one hand, it feels like even because we did a site visit to Newstead Abbey, and yeah, it was just very striking being in that space with a group of young black people, like they're younger dancers in their 20s, and being in that space just kind of was already kind of somehow a statement. It felt to me. And yeah, I think, yeah, so I'm curious to see how that goes. I also feel like, in a way, it feels like it's sort of, I wonder if it will feel like that sort of placing history in a particular location too much. Whereas I
Mm.
feel like, you just need to get the train from, you know, London to Liverpool, and you're traveling on a system that was like largely funded through money from slavery, colonialism, etc. So it's yeah, it's sort of there's something kind of tempting about locating all of those problems with like a few very rich white men who are all dead. And it was, yeah, I feel like it's a much bigger system than that. So yeah, I'm curious what it's going to be like in the stately home. And but I guess something else about that is I'm interested in this metaphor of a haunted house, and I want to, yeah, I want to sort of partly use going to Newstead Abbey to sort of haunt it, and then come away and be haunted by it in the studio and sort of see what that is. Um, so
I was
yeah,
reading up a little bit about kind of haunted houses in literature, and came across an American, uh, both horror and science fiction author, who talks about the haunted house as either the stay away house or the hungry house. So the two dynamics. So the house that wants to creak in the night and make you run, or the house that wants to lure you into the basement or the attic. But he was kind of mapping those two kind of within the genre, because there's so many interesting genres, but within the genre of the haunted house, there's kind of two paths you might take. So you might also get the feeling of what that house wants to do to you at that point. So
yeah, yeah,
um,
yeah, definitely, yeah,
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 yeah, there are plenty of ghost stories surrounding Blue Coat as well. But
yeah,
and we did actually divert your residency. I should say that Blue Coat's open, entirely safe to visit, but we just thought at the moment it's best not to have too much travelling around, and so you were going to bring you up again because you've been to the city before, but we diverted off to Roehampton University for the week, which was very kind of them
yeah,
to host. So we're not speaking the same city, which was originally the plan. But
yeah.
when you were talking like early on in the project, you were still emphasizing haunting as much as horror, but has it tipped more towards horror than haunting at the moment, or is it just kind of still working through all of these modes?
Yeah, I mean, because I started the sort of original like daydream idea was like I want to make a black horror show. I want to make a show that's um, yeah, I guess that has black people in it and that is somehow about blackness, and it's also a horror. It's dealing with that sort of horror aesthetic. That was kind of just me daydreaming on my own. Don't think I even told anyone. And then some opportunities came up to do stuff, and so I sort of looked into it, and I guess um, yeah, then this idea of haunting and being haunted by the past came then once I was in the studio. Um, and I guess, yeah, I feel a little bit like, yeah, I'm going back to the idea of horror. Yeah, because I was sort of talking more about haunting. Um, and yeah, I think, yeah, I guess like it is still about haunting, but I think haunting sometimes to me sounds kind of too lyrical
Mm.
and um, almost pleasant, you know, like being haunted by a favorite song or something. Um, so yeah, yeah, I feel a bit like I do want to get back into to that. And I think, yeah, like I was saying earlier, that thing of sort of, I do feel, yeah, I feel like all the time I'm sort of feeling like, oh, this is too much, this subject, either too much to kind of look into and research, um, or too much for me to like deal with, by making a little dance show. But I kind of think like, yeah, that's sort of, yeah, that's sort of chickening out of it. Um, and yeah, I guess like I think if something is sort of seems impossible, then it's probably worth doing. Yeah.
Um, I'm just going to say to everyone, if there's any questions you want to drop into the chat and the Q&A box, and I've got my eye on both, think absolutely go for it, and I'll kind of do that towards the end or read anything out if you want. But I just was going to ask Rob to share some images from an earlier work, Black Holes, which I managed to see actually in Liverpool thanks to MDI's Leap Festival in 2019, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, everything's like pre or post COVID, so it's probably one of the last major things I saw in the autumn of 2019. Um, and that was probably my first proper introduction to your work, but also it has within it some of these themes, but you're drawing in this case from science fiction and Afrofuturism. Um, and I just wonder if you'd be happy to talk about this piece. I know this is a very different form, and it's actually there's as much spoken as movement. But I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about this piece that comes prior to the haunting kind of project.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think this project that I'm doing now really grows out of Black Holes. Black Holes was is a duet that Alexandrina Hemsley and I co-wrote, that premiered in 2018. And yeah, it tells the history of the universe from the Big Bang right through to the end. And yeah, I guess a kind of fictional science fiction history of the universe. And yeah, it's a way of us discussing our experiences of race and racism. And yeah, I think as when we were making this show, um, I was yeah, we were looking at science fiction, and I was kind of noticing the relationship between science fiction and horror, and that's kind of when I started getting interested in what is. So we were looking at black science fiction, and I was like, what is black horror? Um, and yeah, I mean, I think this show is quite different from the one that I'm making in a few ways. I mean, there's I'm not in the piece that I'm making now, so there's five dancers, and I won't be performing in it. Well, that's the plan. Um, and Black Holes had a lot of text
Mm.
that we spoke and that we wrote together. Um, and yeah, what I'm making now, there is voice and text in it, but it's not kind of particularly central to what's happening. It's not the kind of main focus. So yeah,
So I
yeah,
remember from watching it, and there's, as you're speaking, there's moments you might, if you know Octavia Butler or you know kind of certain references, you might think, oh, I can trace that. And then there's really amazing kind of, well, amazing, but sort of moments, sort of jarring moments where something that might be said to you on the street comes in. So there's a kind of play between different kinds of writing. But yeah, you could possibly trace in a really interesting way some of the references that were in this. Whereas for the new work, do you not exactly more abstract, but will it distill further down from the kind of references you have?
yeah. I mean, I think what's something that feels quite different to me about the process is that when we were making Black Holes, in a way, um, Black Holes was sort of about Afrofuturism and how, we were both really interested in Afrofuturism, and that's how we started thinking about making the piece together. And we were kind of responding. Part of it was us responding to different Afrofuturist texts and kind of, yeah, what we liked about them, what we thought was problematic about it, what resonated with us. Um, so yeah, and that, yeah, like you mentioned, there are a lot of kind of references and allusions to other works in Black Holes, and I think this project that I'm doing now, in a way, sort of started out in a similar way, in that I was just kind of looking at different Black horror texts, but I feel like it's not so much about referencing other works, and it's not kind of about black horror.
Mm.
And well, like you said, abstract. I think it is more kind of, that is more of a jumping off point for this piece, um, black horror. Yeah.
Yeah, or sort of embodied in different kind of way. When you, and this is me being a visual art person, but when you work with a dramaturg and on both pieces, what is their role in terms of of the devising of the work or its structure? How does that work? That kind of role that you have.
Yeah, I think it depends. I mean, because on, yeah, on Black Holes, Alexandrina and I worked with dramaturg Susan Butler,
Mm.
and she worked mainly with the text and the writing that we had in the show, and was sort of involved a little bit in other aspects, but kind of primarily looking at writing. Um, and on this project, I'm working with Charlie Ashwell as the dramaturg, and I mean, a lot of it is conversation, just sort of chatting, sounding out ideas, thinking through things. And yeah, Charlie is sometimes in the studio sitting in, um, and yeah, kind of offering feedback on what's happening. Um, but yeah, I guess it's sort of, yeah, I think in this process, it feels like the dramaturg role is sort of like a sounding board for ideas, and yeah, to sort of help with the kind of thinking um, in general with the project. Yeah,
And you also, because you choreograph your star, but you will also, you were in a Tim Atchell's piece, if I'm right, this weekend. Was
yeah,
that? Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
How often do you step into someone else's work, or was that a bigger part of your earlier career? And now would you do it on very much on a peer-to-peer basis for you to be in someone else's kind of practice?
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, when I finished training, I trained at London Contemporary Dance School. When I left there, the main thing I was doing for, I don't know, 7 or 8 years was performing in other people's shows. And then um, I started performing improvisation, I started teaching, and then I started choreographing as well. And I still do all of those things. Um, Also work in theatre as a movement director. Um, and yeah, I mean, yeah, there's not a sort of big plan, but I don't do that as much as I used to. Perform in other people's work. But I recently did a performance with Tim Etchells, and then I did something with Mary Pearson, who's a Liverpool-based choreographer. So did a couple of performances with her and Mayfield Brooks this year. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's partly just sort of what comes up and fits in and all of that and what works out. But yeah, I it's definitely something I'm still interested in, performing in other people's work, and I feel like there's something kind of healthy about that for me. It's sort of I like doing different roles because it sort of reminds me like what it's like to be a performer, when I'm making stuff, and yeah, um, yeah, it feels sort of uh, I kind of like not getting too fixed in one thing. Um, yeah,
Yeah, you kind of, if it's the right practice, you learn from someone else's practice, don't you, or their kind of
yeah,
mode of working.
yeah.
Um, there is actually a question
Yeah.
which has just dropped in, which I'll read. Thank you, Michael Bennett, saying that they'd like to know what's the most significant book you've read over the last 2 years.
Gosh, well, in relation to this project, last 2 years, yeah, I read a book this year called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa
Mhm.
by Walter Rodney. That was a really great book, sort of, yeah, kind of chronicling the sort of trajectory from trade into the slave trade, into colonialism, and then into neo-colonialism. So it kind of tracks that, and it kind of explains. Yeah, I think something that's great about it is it kind of explains the reasons why those things happened. I think it's sort of sometimes I feel like the conversation is a little bit like, oh, slavery was like some kind of aberration in history, and something that was otherwise kind of moving in the right direction, but there were just happened to be some nasty people who got involved in the slave trade, where it kind of explains sort of the complex reasons why that happened and why it finished, and how it, even though it finished, it transitioned into colonialism and so on. So that was a great book. That's the first thing that comes into my head. Yeah.
Um, I've got an earlier one from Christopher Brown, saying, "Do you see a relationship between horror and dance? So much of horror feels like beats and rhythm to tell the story. Um, so it might be about that kind of sense of dread or rhythm or something."
Yeah. Well, I think, yeah, something that I I kind of felt when I got into the studio on this project, kind of straight away, was the relationship between movement and haunting, and the kind of ephemerality of movement somehow related to me, um, related to the idea of ghosts, things that are sort of there and then not there. Movement sort of appears and disappears almost at the same time. Um, so yeah, that feels like a kind of relationship between the sort of ghosts and the haunting, that feels, yeah, very clear to me, and the sense of like, yeah, this sort of absence of connection with the past. That feels like something, and I guess I also feel like there's a, yeah, I'm at the same time, there's something about like being in a room with people, and yeah, the kind of physical reality of that kind of doesn't go with the idea of a ghost, and that sort of, that interests me as well. It kind of, yeah, it feels like there's tension there, in terms of, yeah, I think, yeah, like I was saying before, I think part of me felt like, oh, this sounds like actually impossible to make a dance piece about haunted houses and colonialism and history and how it impacts the present. Like on one level, it doesn't make any sense to me, and that kind of excites me, that there's something to really figure out. It's not a kind of simple, um, yeah, it's not like, oh, I'll just do, I know how to do this. So yeah, yeah, there's both sides to it for me. Um,
I've got more of a career question from Adam Roberts, which is how much choreographic experience do you have whereby you've been invited to choreograph ensemble works as a guest choreographer? How long was the gap between your completion of training and your first commission? So I guess, yeah, when you were first asked as a guest and then when you were first kind of commissioned after training.
yeah, in my case, probably about 8 years after I finished training. Um, but I think I don't know that that's necessarily sort of standard. I don't know that there is one. I mean, some people, I notice some people, they choreograph a lot when they're students, and they keep choreographing as soon as they graduate, and maybe straight away get asked to make pieces on, uh, other companies or on students. So that can happen. Equally, I think, yeah, yeah. I might be wrong about this, but I was talking to another choreographer, Liz Agis, who I think she was like, had been making work for sort of 30 years or something before she made a commission on a group of students. So yeah, I don't think there's um, a blueprint, for that. Yeah. Um, yeah, and I think like often we don't feel ready to do these things. That's what I noticed, like in myself and talking to other people. That's like, you think, oh, how could I possibly do that or have anything to say in relation to that? Or there's definitely that kind of feeling often, and yeah, and then suddenly these things, then suddenly you are doing it, and yeah.
How did you sort of audition or recruit the dance artists you're working with currently? Was it kind of quite an intimate process, or how did you find so that you know that someone's committed for a duration but also kind of is responding to the kind of themes? How did you go about that process?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like I had made a series of group pieces before with more or less the same group of people who I'd sort of known quite, some of them known quite a while before we even made anything. That was, yeah, several years ago now. With this piece, um, yeah, in different ways. One of the dancers I taught quite a lot, at London Contemporary Dance School. I taught her over 2 years, so I sort of had worked with her quite a bit. And the others, yeah, a couple of them I taught a bit, so I knew them a little bit. And the other two, I'd never been in the studio before we started the first rehearsals. Um, but I think, um, yeah, so I didn't really, I didn't audition them. I just went on intuition. I mean, I feel like I'm like around, seeing who's around, going to see shows, talking, well, going to see shows normally before COVID. Um, yeah, hanging out with people, teaching a lot. So sort of getting to know people and seeing people around. So yeah, I kind of just went with a hunch. Um, and I also, yeah, I think, and I've done this in the past, is I like to work with making group pieces. I like to work with people who've already worked together. So all the dancers have worked with at least some of the other dancers quite a bit before doing this project. So it feels like between us, we've all kind of worked together before. Um, so yeah. Um,
And because in a sense the piece doesn't exist yet, they're informing that
yeah.
as you're devising. So there's also about the trust or the relationship there.
Yeah.
Will you bring a composer into the process, or are you kind of using kind of speech or just movement? How might that kind of develop?
Yeah, I'd like to bring in a composer or a sound designer. I mean, I'm interested in using, I guess, ambient sounds. I'm interested in using the sounds of the dancers moving and speaking and making noises, recording that and using it in the soundscape. And yeah, I don't know how much sort of music there'll be in it. Yeah, I'm not sure. And I'd like the I guess my image of the sound at the moment is that the sound kind of haunts the piece. It's sort of like an echo of what's happening on stage, or yeah, in the space. Um, yeah, but I'm not working at the moment. I'm not working with the sound artist. Yeah.
And assuming things can go to some kind of plan, which is a very big assumption at the moment, but would you see to realize it next year, which I have to think about what year it is, but 2022, is that the kind of next kind of,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that would
Yeah.
be,
Yeah. That's the idea,
yeah.
definitely. Yeah.
I'm not going to jinx
Yeah.
it by suggesting well, we can suggest, but yeah, we won't define. So no, um, thank you. I'm gonna thank you also everyone for your questions. That was it was great to have some questions coming in from you, and they were great questions. I'm going to draw to a close just because you're in the studio all week, and it's a very physical kind of thing, and we're sort of jumping into this process. But it's been fantastic to kind of open it up, and with the idea that in some way we bring you in the project to Blue Coat. So that's our plan, and carry on with the research. So um, it's very exciting to hear it all tonight, and we've shared some of your reading list, and we'll continue to do that. I think if we can, with some of your references, if we stay, but keep the project online with us, we'll kind of share those. I'm just going to quickly plug before I thank you properly an event that's coming up on the 9th of August, which is the identity of activism, and it's an online panel discussion with photographer Leroy Cooper, artist Fosia Johnson, and includes Bafa Koto, the filmmaker, and that's looking at the echoes that have come from the uprisings in 2011, and that's looking at kind of the last 10 years of history. So there's a kind of relationship to some of the research you're doing. But thank you so much, Seke, and we're going to leave everyone very soon, but we will release this with captions sort of within the next month or so. So thank you very much for your time.